Alrighty, so I'm sitting here with Keisha, who was one of the employees with the journal before COVID started. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, could you go into kind of what your experience with the journal was before COVID, your position, and kind of how your perception of what the journal used to do versus where it is now?
Yeah, so prior to COVID, I was a staff writer for about maybe 5 months before COVID started. So the operations were basic, I guess. They were really just like a traditional newspaper. Like, I don't know the background because, like I said, I was just like the staff writer. So basically, every week we would write something, turn it in, and it was basically like to these parameters where we had to have it turned in on Thursday, or I guess it wouldn't be able to print. Um, because I think the newspaper would be printed every Tuesday. So every Tuesday would be printed, and then Wednesday it would come out, and it would be presented for everybody to see. Um, Mainly in the union, I mean, not the union, the UHB building. In the lobby, there would be stacks of the newspaper for everybody to grab. So that was basically the journal then. It was just like a traditional newspaper. In comparison to now, we've definitely shifted a lot. It's been modernized, at least in my opinion. We don't do the paper anymore. It's just like strictly online. So it's just been, that shift to digital has been broadened our horizons a lot. It's enabled us to, shift to content that we weren't able to do in a traditional newspaper. So yeah, it's been a really fun ride for me, at least, just seeing like that shift from traditional newspaper to just strictly online in that way.
Yeah, and like I had a similar experience during my bachelor's where though we didn't go to digital, when I was working at the Lorien, I was the staff writer there for a couple years and then the opinion editor there, so that was always interesting. Um but when it came to like staff writing and how pre-COVID kind of um handled things, do you think that it has become easier now that we've kind of adapted to the way in which COVID forces us to separate from one another in a bit, or do you think it's gotten just different or or complex?
Like from the staff writer point of view.
Staff writer, employee.
Well, I mean, because I only had the staff writer position prior to. So I think, as I was working through it, it got a lot easier for me because it was like, okay, well, hmm, actually, let me rework that. I think it was kind of the same, but in comparison to this semester, the fall semester, in comparison to last, it's gotten a lot easier from my point of view as an assistant editor. I think that the staff writers now have a lot easier because there's wiggle room. Like there's a lot of ideas that can be flown with the editors, and then just like if you have, say, you have an idea and it's like last minute, you could turn that in the last minute, and that would be perfectly fine. Whereas beforehand, it wouldn't have been fine because we wouldn't have been able to print it in time for it to be in the paper for everybody to see.
Yeah, that was one of the things that always drove me nuts too, especially when there
Mhm,
was an opinion piece or something, or there was an error, they turned it on in on the
mhm.
due date, and we'd be like, "Well, you can't use this source. This is very
Yeah.
clearly financed by so and so," especially
Mhm.
when we've got this big issue coming up. Um,
Right.
but now that you've kind of changed your position and how that dynamic has changed, would how would you describe your experience now, not just as a matter of changing your position, but also how you see the journal evolving going forward?
Honestly, like I feel like the journal has grown so much since I've started. Like it's just in terms of content, like we've grown a lot. I think when I first joined, at least we were a lot based a lot in opinion and really just our own, like everybody was in their own world. Whereas now it's like we focus a lot about campus events and things that are going on in Springfield. And I think we've really grown in that way. I actually would have to thank Scott for that because he's kind of kept us focused in that way. But just in terms of content, we've really grown. I feel like in terms of viewership as well, we've just grown a lot. I think that's the best way I could say is we've just grown a lot.
Yeah, and that's something one of the things that I kind of found nice about this is
Mhm.
when I noticed, not to disrespect my old newspaper, but the website is clearly different in terms of its design and
Mhm.
its ability to kind of build on things. Like right now, for example, what we're doing right now, it's pretty simple in that I can record what we're talking about while simultaneously being able to provide multi-layered content from the same
Exactly.
source. So
Mhm.
it's almost like there's a certain, as much as I love paper news and I love the feeling of reading a physical newspaper in the morning with a cup of coffee. Yeah, I know I'm an old man. um, there's also a certain dynamic of I can get this up to YouTube or I can get this up
Mhm.
to podcasting. But now that
Yeah.
were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that it's a lot more multifaceted now. Like it before it was a really one dimensional, but now it's just like do whatever. Like we're open to any idea. That's been the best part, I would say.
So actually, I'd like to circle back to that. So would you say that with the journal's kind of evolution into the digital world, it has given its writers a bit more intellectual freedom than it would have in the past?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I feel like it has especially with the rebrand like in process, like we've definitely just like enabled people to use their creativity to work, however they would like to. Like before, like I said, it was just kind of one dimensional. So there wasn't that freedom to do whatever you can. I mean,
Mhm.
whatever you wanted to, but now it's like, yeah, be free, be creative, do what you want to do.
Yeah, like basically still fulfill the standards, still focus
Yeah,
on
of
being
course.
based in fact, but take your own approach, give us something that we can work with, sort of thing.
Exactly.
Um, but with the rebrand of the journal, because I think this is a perfect opportunity to kind of see how the journal's kind of changing. How do you think the rebranding and the constant like trying of to appeal to more people might affect the journal in the future? And how do you think that that's going to affect your job and others around you?
Honestly, I think it's just going to kind of tie everything together. It's just basically tying in what we've been doing, but just making it more public because I think in the past year, like we've had a lot of problems with viewership and trying to get people engaged with the journal since we're not in the newspaper distribution anymore. So I think it's basically just like reworking what we've already been building a foundation on and just making it solidified. So like the rebrand, the whole new name, the new logo, it's just kind of just, yeah, it's completing the transformation that we've already been doing.
Before we go, I just want to ask, what do you think your role in the journal will be with the rebrand, and how do you think that your work has contributed to the journal's growth on a personal level?
On a personal level, I feel like I've just been more of a facilitator. Like I've just been, kind of overseeing what everybody's been doing. I can't say I have been as interactive in terms of like the newer things, like the podcast that people have been or Andrew has been doing and that you've been looking to do and like videos and all that. I have to thank the team. Like we've all been working as a team to make this a reality. So I can't say I've been more interactive in that way, but I've been more of the facilitator. Like, okay, give us your ideas. We can look over and make sure everything's good. So I think that's definitely been my role so far. I would definitely be interested in doing it, but just with the way my schedule works, it's kind of been difficult. But yeah, I just would say that I will just keep facilitating everything, making sure everything is good. Everybody's been turning in great work, so it's something to be proud of, honestly.
So in a way, you're kind of what part of the reason we have the intellectual freedom we have, because you're helping facilitate it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Well,
with the help of Jacob as well.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for talking to me. I know that you've got a lot of work to do, so I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
no problem. And I'm glad to help, honestly.
So I am sitting here with Scott Feingold, who was one of the employees for the journal and one of the people who helps oversee the journal today. Uh, Thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, sure. Just for the record, it's actually pronounced Feingold. It's a weird
Oh, sorry about that.
That's fine. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. You're welcome. I'm a member of the faculty of the communication department. My title is Director of Student Media, and I act as a faculty advisor for the UIS Journal.
All righty. So the reason I brought you into this is because we're doing the Beyond, and we wanted to talk about how the journal has kind of evolved from where it was before COVID to where it is now. So I've asked Keisha this before, but I wanted to get your perspective. How was your experience with the journal, both as somebody in faculty, but also somebody who works day to day with this? What was that like before COVID, and what was the kind of relationship between where it is now versus where it was in the past?
Really, the biggest difference was just that when the campus closed down due to the pandemic, we moved all of our activities in the middle of that semester to online. So, and that was the first time I'd ever used Zoom at all. It was the first time I'd ever taught or dealt with anything online. And so there was a bit of a learning curve as far as that went. I think we were doing group phone calls for a while, and it was a little awkward, but the work never stopped. We went from having a weekly meeting on Sunday at 3 in an office, where we all drove out or walked over and sat around and saw each other face to face, sat around a table and basically did the exact same thing that we do in the Zoom meetings now, except we were all there. It was even at the same time. And the function was the same, except for the fact that we had a print version of the paper that we used to do. And that was a very different thing in terms of, in a couple different ways, but in terms of just the practical process. We kept the same weekly process of, the schedule of having stories due on Thursday, edited by Tuesday. And then back then we would send the fully designed paper in a file to a printer who would print out copies, and then we would have to physically go pick them up and then have them distributed. So a whole bunch of that went by the wayside. But we kept the same schedule, and instead of having it all ready to go in one shot so that people could pick it up and page through it, we started putting the stories out little by little during the week online. That was one big difference. And even though it was more expensive and more impractical in some ways to run the paper back then, because we had to actually there was a job description of a distributor whose job was to take a university vehicle out of town to pick up the paper and then take it all around to where it needed to go. We had to physically pay the printer, so there was money that was going out. But also at the same time, we had money coming in. A big part of the difference between then and now is financial. We had regular advertisers who paid every week to be in the print edition of the paper. And when the paper went away, we weren't able to, the physical paper went away, we weren't able to translate that into the equivalent ads online. It was one of the big ironies of the online revolution in terms of news, is that you can't sell ads on websites anywhere near as well as you can sell them on a print paper, mostly because of number crunching. Advertisers don't trust that their ad's going to be seen when it's just a banner or as pop-up or it's something, but they do trust that anybody looking at the paper is going to see their ad if they're paging through it. So even though the idea is financially, and it's the reality is that, the print paper is dead and the online hub is the thing of the future, financially, it's nowhere near as reliable. And the thing is that the biggest difference from my point of view as someone who is responsible for the paper functioning on a day-to-day basis, there's no managing editor, there's no publisher. So really, as the advisor, I kind of have all of that. I don't control or influence the content of the stories, but I do have to make sure that things run properly, and that includes keeping track of the budget. And we have been running absolutely in the red since the beginning of the pandemic, where we used to always be in the black. That's been the biggest difference. As far as the content of the material that we've been putting out goes, I would say we've actually gotten better. I think that the online, in terms of the stories that we've been putting up and the evolution of the way that the paper's been running, this change where we're going into having video podcasts and just more interactive, more inclusive content is great, and I'm really proud of it. And I don't think it would have gone in this direction without the pandemic. So it's a silver lining kind of story, or maybe it's really the silver cloud with a dark lining. It might be the other way around, because the bigger picture, it's really good. It's just a matter of figuring out the drudgery and sort of the sellout language of monetizing this thing that we are really proud of in terms of content and mission. That's a long answer.
It's a very difficult thing, because I know a lot of news sources, not just like college newspapers, but other news sources, local, national, have also struggled with the transfer to online, even when they have a paper section. Like the New York Times, they sometimes struggle and are getting mad at Facebook because it takes most of the ad revenue from them, even though they drive a lot of the attention with controversial stories and things like that. But on the note of like going online, Keisha mentioned to me that a lot of the old content tended to be opinion based, and a lot of the content didn't necessarily diversify. So would you say that with COVID and with the online change, that the journal's content has actually diversified, have become perhaps more useful in its actual value, or would you say it has remained the same with some minor modifications?
I'd say neither of those is exactly accurate. I think that a lot of that content that Keisha is referring to had more to do with the individual personalities and interests of the staff members than it did that we had at the time versus the ones we have now. I think that people got more serious with COVID overall. I think that there's more of a focus on kind of, it was kind of the world itself, the world of news, the world of UIS, or just university news was, it might have seemed more frivolous. Things definitely feel more urgent during and post-COVID, during this whole period. And I think it made, made people more serious. But it seems like the people who are around now who were around then, as they've gradually gone away and we've replaced them with new people, the newer staff members just seem more diverse and more serious than the crop of people who we had interviewed before. Whether that has to do with COVID or not, or if it just would have been the same level of talent and focus, either way, there's no way to tell. But a lot of the content that I see, honestly, from like you, Andrew, Maria, all new people are the ones who are kind of driving the seriousness of it all, and Jacob as well. And again, I don't know if that would have been the case with the same staff without COVID happening, but I tend to put it towards the personalities and values of the individual reporters. We just have a really good crop right now. I would say also, again, not to disparage anybody before, and it might have to do with COVID, but, we had, when I came in, we had a multimedia editor, Kenny's position, and a business manager, Edward's position, that were kind of, the jobs were kind of set and they were kind of, I wouldn't say rote, but they just knew what they're going to be doing from week to week, and it was kind of a routine. And then in between, we went without graduate assistants in a couple of positions, a couple of semesters, just because of pandemic-based issues with students that we interviewed not being able to make it to campus or having to drop out for one reason or another. But Edward and Kenny are really good, and they're really serious about the form that the paper is taking. With the previous multimedia editor and the previous business managers that we had, or without those positions filled, I don't know if we'd be able to make this transition that we're making. But because Edward has been so serious about pushing stuff like the crowdfunding campaign, the rebranding, and because Kenny is so he's such a go-getter in terms of transforming the material that the staff is giving him into, you know, a good product that looks good, you know, on the web. I don't know that it just seems like we've just really run into, for whatever reason, a bunch of really, really good staff members right now. And whether we can thank COVID for that or not is speculative to me, but it definitely corresponded with it, you know. But, you know, it's like, you know, the whole correlation causation thing, I just hesitate to draw it. But you know, I just think that we're in better shape than we've been in a long time, and I'm really excited about all the changes that are happening, you know, in terms of the you know, just, I think we've had, even just this semester so far, more impact on campus. I think we're seeing numbers that are better. I think we've got more visibility, maybe because of the campaigns and the contests, and because we're writing stories about COVID and writing stories about things that people care about. But for whatever reason, I just feel like we're, you know, again, it's hard to say whether we're reacting in a, you know, to this circumstance and it's driving us to do better work, or whether we're better equipped to do good work and the circumstance happens to, you know, be commensurate with it.
So it's one of those things where it's like reaction versus adaptation sort of thing.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure, but I just think that, you know, whether or it's correlation or causation, or somewhere in between, as almost everything usually is, I think that we are very well equipped right now to move forward into this, you know, beyond COVID world that we're in, you know, or that we're speculating on, hopefully putting this all behind us. I think we're in way better shape than probably the paper would have been in if COVID had never happened. So, you know, the fact that we got pushed online by COVID, I can say that probably has accelerated, if not actually caused, a lot of the innovations that we've been able to make. But so many other factors, like really good recent staff member hires, you know, the graduate assistants doing stellar work. It's just one of those things where everything seems to be coming together in a really good way. But, you know, if it hadn't been for COVID, maybe we'd still be trying to struggle to print up the paper every week, and we wouldn't even have thought of adapting to this cooler, better, more relevant version of the you know, student media that we're working on now.
So kind of on that note, the journal is rebranding itself a bit. And I was wondering if you could go into kind of what motivated staff members like yourself, like Keisha, like Jacob, to consider rebranding the journal, and how that has related to the newspaper's evolution in the post-COVID world, if there ever is one.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to be post-COVID having happened world, whether COVID is still happening or not. It depends. Maybe there's a better, you know, yeah, I don't even know what the right word would be. Somebody needs to come up with that right verbiage where we say, yeah, post-COVID implies it's over with. But we're also like, after it happened, even though it's still happening, it's like
The first hit.
Yeah, exactly. You never know. But okay, well, I'll tell you, this is a very personal issue for me, and a personal / professional issue for me. Because when I came, I'm going to probably give you more information than you need, but I have to put it in context in order for it to make sense when I say it. So basically, when I came on board, there hadn't been, the position I'm in didn't exist before. The director of student media overall just wasn't the thing. There was a faculty member who worked in the radio, who did radio, student radio streaming, and taught classes in that, and had like there was actually not NPR, but a separate little tiny student streaming radio studio, and he ran that. And then the paper, the journal, was run out of the student affairs department, not communication. Now, through a bunch of really convoluted circumstances, communication took over right around the time, so it took over the paper right around the time that both the old advisor that worked under student affairs and the radio guy both retired. So when they created my position, I was supposed to basically amalgamate those two jobs into one, but instead of it being in student affairs, it was now under communication.
That must have been a surprise.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was in on it to some extent, in that I was an adjunct, and I'd been a recent graduate with my master's degree. And so I sort of had a ringside seat for the changes as they were going on. But then they just put out a national, search, and I applied with a bunch of other people. I ended up getting the job. So then I was supposed to work on the radio station on one hand, work on get it up and running, because again, not to disparage anybody, but the radio had been left in disarray. It was not functioning. There were no students taking the class, and the guy retired. And when I finally got keys to the old radio studio, it was basically just sitting there. It was like somebody, I always say it looked like somebody abandoned it in an air raid. It hadn't been open in a year, and there was half-drunk coffee cups, and there was just stuff all over the place. And the machines have been left on. The radio, all the equipment, and most of them weren't functioning anymore. And so my two jobs were to try to run the newspaper, just keep it going day to day, and to try to get the radio functioning again. Don't want to go into too much detail, but the radio just ended up being kind of a boondoggle. This kept on working on it for about a year, buying new equipment, trying to get it to work. Then I was going to have to promote the radio so it was all just turning into a big problem right around that same time. So I was spinning my wheels trying to make that happen, and trying to set up a space, what do they call that, a student media center, where the students who worked for the journal and other people could kind of hang out, kind of a band room vibe. So I was working on trying to get okayed space to make that happen, and trying to get the radio physically going. Then COVID happened right around just right when that was starting to get off the ground. And so instead of continuing on that line, I sort of pushed the whole radio concept, which was going to be just streaming anyway. We didn't have an antenna or anything, so most of it was not going to be live, into the mission of the journal. So it was really all me in a way. I came to Jacob and Keisha, and I kind of just said, hey, let's see if we can do podcasting and do radio type stories, the kind of things that you would do on NPR. So, do videos and do things like that. So kind of folding in my other duties with the radio that were not really going forward, and making it all into one thing, and do it all off the journal website. But then once we started doing that, it was kind of this new thing. It wasn't the journal anymore. The journal was, a printed newspaper that just happened to have a website attached. Now, we didn't have a printed newspaper, we had a website, but the website was doing a lot more stuff, a lot more types of content. So that's why we came up with the idea of rebranding it and just kind of having it be a student media hub or center online where all kinds of content could happen, including newspaper type reporting, but not limited to that. So, a lot of it was really just driven by the fact that, I was kind of tasked with making this radio thing happen. It wasn't happening, but we had this already going on. And so it kind of became that, and working in, I'm connected with with NPR here locally, that runs out of UIS. You had the idea for I think, Conor, you were talking about doing the radio, not the radio, but the audio, the podcast version of the paper.
Yeah.
Would happen every week. That would happen like every week or so. That is exactly what was pitched to me by Randy Eccles from NPR, saying we would like to have a version of it like that would then be part of their community voices section on NPR Illinois. And so we're kind of built. I have connections there that want to help the journal, that want and help us move into this new era. But yeah, the rebrand was really just a whole bunch of stuff that needed to happen and wasn't happening. And just kind of, it was sort of, I don't want to take all the credit, but it was kind of my brainchild to take the radio streaming idea and merge it with the journal to make a new thing.
So in a way, it's kind of like, just like you mentioned earlier, the journal's evolution in terms of from where it started with COVID kind of came with how we are now seeing it different, and the rebrand is sort of intended to reflect that reality.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's something that I've kind of noticed. Like initially, like before I joined the journal, I was a newspaper opinion editor out in Iowa, and they have a website, but for the most part, the main thing is print. And it's one of those things where you kind of have to wonder, how much longer can this form of media continue without having some sort of trouble? But before I go, I just want to ask one last question. Where do you think the journal and really this student media kind of situation will go from here, and how do you think it will grow once COVID either calms down or comes to an end?
Well, the whole idea is for whatever the name, it's hard to talk about it because it's not going to be the journal very soon. We're doing this whole, but whatever the journal turns into is going to be hopefully the evolution that we're working for. Evolution, in a Darwinian sense doesn't work that way, but the evolution that we're trying to make happen is that we want it to go from being something that's very, again, I tend to express the positive in terms of the negative, but when the paper was the paper only, people, honestly, I'm teaching journalism classes and stuff, and the students that I had who were self-selecting, who were taking journalism classes on purpose to learn about journalism, didn't know that there was a student newspaper. And when they found out that there was a student newspaper, they didn't much care. You know what I mean? It was like when I would give them an assignment in editorial class to read a newspaper, any newspaper, and talk about it in the terms of what we learned during the class. They didn't even, they acted like they didn't know where to find one. Like we were so far down the line from what, like you were talking about, how long can this exist? We're so far away from the old world of dad comes home and reads the newspaper in the chair while, the kids all play around and they grab the comics page from him, that sitcom cliche.
I
What
may
we're
have indulged that cliche a couple of times because I used to get the paper every Sunday. Still do on occasion if I feel like I have the time to sit down.
Well, it's great when it can happen, but it's like so much of many of the students that I had, it was like some sort of like reverse science fiction. Like that was only another world where something like that would happen. Their parents would never even have had a paper around the house. So, you know, it was like foreign to them. And they were students who were taking a class in journalism. So, you know, the rest of the students were an even harder sell. But God, not to be condescending, but boy, the kids sure do love a good podcast. You know, they sure do. You know what I mean? It's like, it's funny because there's this cliche about millennials and Zoomers or whatever that they don't have an attention span, but podcasts take a serious attention span. They're very long form. So I just think it's not really, just from my experience with students, I just don't think that's a fair characterization, a fair stereotype. But I feel like the information that is valuable has to come in a different way. And so if the journal, whatever our new name is going to be relevant in a serious way to the campus community, it has to, COVID or not COVID, be something they actually want to visit, that they actually want to interact with, not just some pieces of paper that are folded up that are going to get ink on their hands. People like, you know, they like to go to an interesting looking web page, or they like to click on a link with an interesting story. They like to listen to a podcast. They like to watch a video, you know, in a way that doesn't compare at all to the lack of interest that we were finding, no matter how good our content was in the paper. So as director of student media, as advisor for the journal, and somebody who's, you know, de facto, you know, managing editor or whatever, I want to see it engage with the campus, with the student community, with the faculty, with everybody in a way that is relevant and current and important. And I feel like the way that we are moving things now is on track with that. You know, that I think that people are going to be more likely on campus to engage with this kind of material presented in this way. And, you know, we're looking into all kinds of other ways to engage with the community. We're going to start potentially a syndication page on there where we would offer, you know, already existing student podcasts, you know, a platform where we would syndicate those, you know, and try to make it into just a destination where, instead of it being like, oh, here's a, you know, I wonder what's on the internet, oh, you know, maybe we'll stumble across something on whatever the new name of the journal ends up being, but more like a, you know, what's happening there today, what kind of, you know, how, you know, I have a great idea, let's see if the journal's interested in it, let's go to their podcast page and see what's new, see if Conor's new podcast is up, see if Andrew's new podcast is up. I just feel like if our real mission is to represent and interact with the campus, this is the way to go. You know, again, it might not have happened in this form if COVID hadn't happened and forced us into an online situation, but regardless, I think it's a necessary step, and I'm excited about it. I really think we can make a much bigger impact this way than we would strictly with the written version or the printed version. I will add to that, and it's a ways in the future because we're still working on trying to get out of the financial hole that we ended up in because of losing our advertising, the print version. But eventually we would like to go back to having a smaller run version of the print edition of the paper. But that's going to be for a future time. You know, we don't want it to be like all of our budget tied up in it, you know, hundreds and hundreds of copies. But I don't think it's a dead form. I just think it needs to be no pun intended, folded in with this whole multimedia thing. That would just be one of the media.
All right. Thank you very much for joining me. This was a wonderful conversation.
Well, yeah, thanks. I have a tendency to monologue, so I hope I didn't give you too much.
No, don't worry about it. Works perfectly.